The controversy. Sometimes for us who live around 2,000 years after Christ, it seems that the first church had a blast in their experience with God, and everything was magical and smooth, and kind of always sunny. But was it really like that, or not? On the contrary, they had their own disagreements, big ones, heated arguments, and some political fights within the greater community. Here is one big controversy. Some teachers from the party of the Pharisees were convinced that any Gentile convert to the faith had to become Jew first and then a Christian in the church, to be circumcised first and then to be saved. However, the council in Jerusalem upheld just the opposite decision. So, how do you resolve a dilemma like that?
Let's just step back for a moment and remind that we are studying the letter from Paul to the Romans that he wrote in an attempt to protect them from the issues that he experienced in Galatia and to which the study last quarter was dedicated. It's not easy when you are so used to certain things, especially when they get entangled into your culture as well. For a long time, people have waited for the coming of the Messiah. They had even ceremonies to experience what it all meant. But they got so entangled into the doings that when the Messiah came, they didn't recognize him. When he showed them what his kingdom is about, they didn't get it. It took some time, but their hearts started opening. They rejoiced the salvation that they were given through the sacrifice of Jesus. But they were still missing some big points, and many were still too used to the things that they liked from before.
Paul became a fervent defender of the new covenant that Jesus brought with him. This new covenant had new promises and a new way of becoming part of it. No longer was needed the observance of rituals or the in-temple worship procedures that serve the purpose to teach the sinner the way of salvation. Jesus now was the ultimate fulfillment of all of that. People were walking in new clothes, in a different style. Now it was all about having the law written in your heart and in your mind, not written on a plate of stone hidden somewhere in the Ark of the Covenant. Times have changed. For people, though, it was difficult.
The lesson gets into some explanations of the different categories of the Old Testament law, like moral, ceremonial, health, civic, etc., even though it admits that there is no such clear separation and that in the mind of the Jew, they were kind of a package. The point, though, is that things have a reason and a purpose. Sometimes people say, if God said it, it's true, and it can't change. This is true, but there is also why did he say it and what was the purpose of it. The sacrificial ceremonies, for example, they were pointing to the sacrifice of Jesus. And when the types met their antitypes, there was no reason for them anymore. It's important to understand and not just to do or to follow traditions.
Originally, Christians came out of the Jewish nation. So naturally, they were living their rituals, their traditions, their observances. The question was, were they ready for a change? Were they ready to accept salvation by faith only and toss away the burden that the law has carried for so many centuries? The struggle for the first church became so big that Paul and Barnabas got into a sharp dispute and debate with some believers in circumcision, to the point that they had to make a trip back to Jerusalem from Antioch and demand a statement from the council in Jerusalem. And guess what? Peter stood up and asked the elders in the council, "Why do you try to test God by putting on the Gentiles a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors were able to bear?" And the rest is history.
Yes, there was a decision, and the church understood that salvation was only through the righteousness of Jesus, and that imposing practices that had meaning under certain circumstances and time was meaningless in other circumstances and was becoming more of a burden and a yoke. Not everyone agreed with it though, and this is the controversy to which this lesson is dedicated. There is another point that the lesson makes, which is interesting. It's about the church body. Paul talked many times about his authority and message given directly by Jesus, but he also acknowledged the church body. He wanted a common solution and resolution of the issue. He worked with the council. This is important.
Probably we should look at ourselves and see, are there any rules that we have enforced on us or probably on our families that are just a yoke, unnecessary yoke to bear? And it's good to revise how do we communicate our gospel with others, because probably we might be laying some burdens in the form of traditions that are powerless to work out any salvation in their lives. And let's be humble when we do that.
Absolutely. But this is also a two-way street. And here is a good reminder from the lesson. Although Jewish believers weren't to impose their rules and tradition on Gentiles, the council wanted to make sure that the Gentiles didn't do things that would have deemed offensive to the Jews who were united with them in Christ. It's important to have respect for people's understandings, beliefs, and practices.
And finally, the lesson ends with a very, very strong point that following the Jewish traditions and laws has become a denial of the gospel of Christ itself. We read this in the part for Thursday. This shook me down. Is it really that dangerous to follow Jewish traditions and laws? We studied the Galatians last quarter, and Paul made it clear how real this is. And let's not forget, we are talking about a controversy. Which side are you going to take? And I pray that God give you his revelation.
It's very easy to shift focus in this study. Some made it about how the entire law is abolished and unnecessary. Others get into some special theological gymnastics trying to prove that it's just about certain law and not other law. However, the core of the problem is on how we see and understand salvation. The key is in salvation and not so much in the law. The study of the Galatians helped us a lot. Hopefully, this study will build on that.
So join us next week when we're going to look at the human condition.